Welcome to another Hearts of Iron 4 video. This time we're going to be doing something a little bit different than we're used to. We're going to be doing a mod spotlight. What is that, you may ask? Well, it is going to be a sort of video series-ish, where I'm going to be looking at the contents of a few mods I really like to play with, and I will be explaining them to you and providing the links, and yeah, just so that good mod makers have a little bit more attention, because honestly the work they do is very important for PC gaming and it wouldn't be the same without it. And the mod we will be going over today is a very interesting mod called the Extended Rework mod, which is an expansion in and of itself of the Naval Rework mod. Now, if we go to the Naval tech tree, we can see what the Naval Rework mod is. Essentially, normally there would be only one line of destroyers, one line of light cruisers, one line of heavy cruisers, one line of battleships, and one line of aircraft carriers, and also one line of submarines. What the Naval Rework mod does is it adds the large submarine class to the game, which is essentially just big normal submarines that some countries decided to do. It adds coastal submarines, which is a modification actually of the regular submarines. As you can see, for example, for Germany that we're playing, the modification of the Type 7C would be the Type 2D, and it would be a coastal submarine, of course very low range, but with a few advantages, and of course very cheap. Then they added light carriers to the game. They added heavy carriers to the game, which I believe is supposed to be something like the Japanese Taiho or Shinano, something like that. And they added, well, super heavy battleships were already in the game, but then they essentially changed the regular battleship lines so that it's normally just regular battleships and then battle cruisers and later on fast battleships. These fast battleships are essentially what the American Iowa and the British King George V class were, and the Italian Vittorio Veneto. Whereas these battleships on the bottom are more just the traditional developments of the battleship that was sort of, you know, as you can see, it's like the Bismarck, that one, those kind of ships. And then in cruisers, what they did is kind of interesting, because there's also pocket battleships. What's called basically these were German ships during World War II, and they were essentially big, very big cruisers that weren't quite battle cruiser. A battle cruiser is just a battleship without armor, essentially, that can reach the speeds of a cruiser. Whereas the pocket battleship was more like a cheap battle cruiser. It was meant to be not as big. So they added pocket battleships to the game, which is pretty cool. And as you can see, the Germans get the Deutschland class, which is what they used. And they were mostly meant for a raiding role. And they also added coastal battleships, which is something that the Scandinavian countries used. Like Sweden. Sweden had like 2 coastal battleships. Essentially, these were cruisers. As you can see, if we go back to the tech tree, they are modifications of the standard heavy cruiser, because of course these were ships used in the 1920s, just to give you an idea of the era. And essentially they packed the guns of a battleship, but since they were built on cruiser hulls, they couldn't go into ocean, so they had to be kept at essentially coastal, as a coastal defensive ship. So that is kind of cool that they added this as well. And then they have normal heavy cruisers, of course, and then in light cruisers, which is kind of cool, they have normal light cruisers and large light cruisers. That's kind of a redundant thing in my opinion, but what they did is they added a modifications to the normal light cruiser called the AA cruiser, which is a bit like the American Atlanta class, which is kind of cool. And then in destroyers, they differentiated between destroyers and large destroyers. Now, large destroyers were something that, for example, the Italian Navy did, something that the German Navy did, the American Navy, and also the Japanese Navy, and the French as well. Essentially, they were just really big destroyers that were made to essentially keep up with larger ships in a more sort of ocean combat role. And yeah, that's kind of the core of the mod, considering it is a modification of that. But the creators of that mod decided to spice it up a little bit, and they made a huge rework of the artillery, armor, and also industry trees. So that is very appreciated. The industry tree rework is essentially the expanded industry mod. If you've played with the expanded industry mod, you can recognize a few of its features. For example, the heavy industry tech line, which increases your factory output, max factories in a state, and allows you to build steel mills, which increase your steel production in a province. And also the differentiation between synthetic oil refineries and synthetic rubber refineries. So essentially, if we go to construction, as you can see, we can build steel mills, which improve the steel production. We can build rubber plants, synthetic rubber plants, which increase the rubber production, and synthetic oil refineries. In the normal game, of course, there is synthetic oil and synthetic rubber are kind of grouped together. And so this kind of allows you to be a little bit more specialized. And if you go to trade, as you can see in some of my provinces, you can see I've got synthetic oil, synthetic rubber, and it's just helpful. And then if we go to explaining what the armor and artillery rework is all about, well, the artillery is essentially something that I was really hoping that was going to come out in some form, because as you can see, there's heavy artillery, and light artillery. Now, in World War II, essentially, different countries classified their artillery pieces differently. And, for example, the Germans classified 150 millimeter something howitzers as heavy artillery, and 120, 105, those kind of pieces as normal artillery, and then 75 millimeters would be light artillery. Other countries have had, of course, different classifications. For example, the Soviets had 122 millimeters of caliber as normal artillery, and 203 millimeters as heavy artillery, for example. And so what they did is they added the 3 different types of artillery. In the normal game, it would only be regular artillery, and in the other Hearts of Iron games, there was also a heavy artillery. Essentially, what the difference between these is, of course, heavy artillery is much more powerful at fighting infantry. If we go to, for example, the latest tech, it's got 68 soft attack per unit, per battalion, whereas the normal artillery only has 48. But at the same time, the lighter the artillery, the more hard attack. That's actually kind of cool, because, of course, a lighter artillery would be more used in a direct fire role, thus being more used against armor. Excellent. And also, lighter artillery, of course, do not reduce your speed quite as much. So, for example, the normal light artillery has 4.5 maximum speed, which doesn't slow down infantry units at all. So that is very useful, for example, if you want to have a fast-moving light unit, like a MOD division or a paratrooper. And so that's exactly what you want to have for a game that is like, in general, that allows you to customize your army that much more. And then what they added is also a lot more techs that improve your artillery in certain ways. For example, this artillery correction, which increases your defense, breakthrough, and soft attack for all artillery. Or down the line, artillery coordination, which also improves your soft attack and breakthrough. And then the rocket artillery line is pretty much the same. They also added a little bit of text to the anti-air and anti-tank, and they also added heavy anti-air. Now, heavy anti-air is essentially what, for example, the Soviet 90mm gun would be, or the British Vickers, I believe 90mm as well, and the, of course, very famous German 88mm gun would be. So that is kind of useful. And then they also added, for example, fire control techs, which require mechanical computing and computers, radars, which, of course, increase the air attack of your anti-air brigades. Because, of course, they are more accurate. And then they added a few techs to the anti-tank as well. For example, different types of ammunition to increase your armor-piercing damage. And so that is very cool that they added all of this stuff. Then in armor, they added actually tankettes to the game. Tankettes were something that the Italian army and the Polish army, for example, also the Soviet army, but not as much. I mean, the Soviet army, they abandoned the tankette very early on. For example, the Italian and Polish armies, which were armies that didn't really have a lot of industry to back them up, so they had what they called tankettes, which are essentially really small tanks, like a bit of a halfway between an armored car and a tank, and a light tank actually. And what those were used for is essentially try to be a fast vehicle that could just be resistant to infantry and support allied infantry and just do that kind of stuff. So that is kind of cool that they added these. Of course, their line ends quite early because they were a developmental dead end. The idea of the tank had kind of died with the beginning of the war. They weren't really that good. Then they added armored cars, which you will see later have also an interesting... they're not only a combat thing, they're very interesting addition to the game. And then they added a whole bunch of text to, of course, normal armor. What they added was something that they call an infantry tank, because essentially in the interwar period, this is represented very well by this dichotomy, the Panzer III and the Panzer IV-C. Essentially, what in the interwar period was happening is countries were designing their armored forces to have so-called infantry support tanks, and essentially just what some people called cavalry tanks or cruiser tanks. This was especially for the British and also the Germans. Even though the German was a little bit different, their texture was a little bit different. Essentially, what that meant was having a tank that can fight infantry and then having a tank that can move fast and fight other tanks. That was the main idea behind that. And what this represents is the fact that at some point down the line, these two roles were merged into one, what we now call the medium tank, and then was later introduced. The medium tank later developed into what we call the main battle tank in the Cold War. So as you can see in the tech tree, you go and the infantry tanks go right back into the medium tank branch, but then they have another branch that goes further and they go into heavy tanks. So, and the heavy tanks then go into super heavy tanks and etc, etc. And then the medium tanks go into the main battle tanks that we know. And then they also added a lot of extra text for industry related to armor. For example, armor construction reduces, improves your armor. Then this, cast construction or welded construction. Essentially, these were two different methods of building vehicles. I believe the Germans used cast and the Soviets used welded, for example, because welded was a little bit harder to produce, and the Germans didn't really have the capabilities to produce the kind of welded steel that would be good. So essentially what the Germans did with the cast system is essentially the cast armor type is just building a whole hull of a vehicle and then just building it whole. Whereas welded is building different parts of a vehicle and then welding them together, of course. I believe that's how it works. I'm not really sure. This is, of course, just me reading from the internet, not really an expert on armored construction or engineering or anything like that. And then they added the text stabilizers, which is something that allows tanks to fire on the move a little bit easier, which in the real war was only extensively used by the Americans because it was a fairly expensive and new technology. And then what else did they add? They seem to have added actually modifications for heavy tanks as well. So not only for light tanks and medium tanks, you can now build, for example, self-propellatory and tank destroyers, but also from heavies. So for example, from the King Tiger, you can build the Jag Tiger and the GW Tiger. So that is a very cool addition as well. And then for the armored cars, you will see now, no changes to land doctrines, infantry, air quite yet. But they may actually do something with it. They have actually added a new thing, which is carrier jet fighters. Before they didn't exist, so now it's cool that they do exist. And they also have added a third carrier, or a third jet fighter, and a third jet bomber, and also a jet strategic bomber. So that is really cool. I really like jet strategic bombers and that idea in general. And then it doesn't seem like there's any more text. So you may be asking yourself, how were they implemented? How all these new units were implemented into the actual game? So let's go and look at units. As you can see, there's a few different NATO counters that you may not recognize. For example, Armored Car Recon. Armored Car Recon is, of course, a recon unit that uses armored cars. So it not only provides the regular recon bonuses, it also provides quite a bit of defense, breakthrough, and attack, because of course this is just a armored car. It can also fight. Then they have, of course, since they have light artillery. Actually, I'm gonna go in the deploy screen because it's gonna be a little bit easier. As you can see, these are all the new, or rather, some of them are old, but there's also some of the new support companies. They, of course, since they split all the artilleries in free, then now you can have support artillery that's medium artillery, support artillery that's light artillery, and support artillery that's heavy artillery. As you can see, heavy artillery decreases your movement in rough terrain by quite a bit, and that makes sense because these were guns that were pretty much only able to be transported with motorized equipment. So you could not essentially, you really could not bring these guns and move them through marshes, for example. And then they also added armored engineers, which is of course engineers that are mechanized, which is kind of cool for just your regular tank divisions. Then maintenance company is the same. And then, of course, in the normal branch, you can add heavy artillery, artillery, and light artillery as you wish. So that is excellent. And then, if we go to tank divisions, it's pretty much the same, except that, of course, as you can see, you can now use infantry tanks in your armies. So that is also very interesting. It is more of a, of course, earlier game vehicle, but you can use them. And then, if we go to navies, which is the other thing that they changed, we can select my main navy. As you can see, we can see some of the newer... Oh, you've sunk a ship. A DD. Interesting. You can see some of the newer ships that they added in action. For example, the battle cruiser line. For example, this Oldenburg ship. And then, for example, the pocket battleship, the Deutschland. And as you can see, they are considered a cruiser, but instead they're a pocket battleship. And then, of course, light A cruisers, etc., etc. So that is just a taste of this mod. As you can see, I've played a bit of a campaign with it. I'm at 1943. They haven't really changed anything in diplomacy. They've changed a little bit of the AI in terms of the way it builds divisions, because of course they added new battalions, new ways to actually build divisions. And so if we can go to over here, the division builder, you can see that a lot of infantry type 2, mountaineers type 1, all these divisions were added automatically. I didn't really have a say in the adding, because these are troops that were sent in by my allies. And if we go to see what divisions they are much better than the divisions that normally the AI would build. And that is because, of course, they have implemented a few improvements to the AI that kind of makes it so you can have a little bit better of an experience fighting the AI, because normally they'd build really bad divisions. Then, is there something else to talk about, really? Yeah, pretty much no. So tell me in the comments what you think about the mod. Tell me in the comments what you think about, in general, mods for Hearts of Iron. And yeah, so I'll see you soon, and I hope that you try this mod. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you soon.